Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Jamie with THE Student, and this is the second in our series of live webinars during THE Student Funding Week. During this session, we're going to discuss funding your degree in the UK. I know you all have loads of questions about this. We've been conducting an informal poll via Instagram this week to learn a little bit more about what our student audience wants to know about funding. And 88% of the respondents said that finding information about funding for international students is hard. And 86% said that they feel put off from applying to certain countries if funding information isn't clear. And so that's why we're here this week with THE Student Funding Week. We hope that this series of webinars, along with all of the resources on our site, will help you learn about where to look for funding options, make you more aware of what is available, and also just sort of demystify the process for you so that everything is a bit clearer. Before we jump into a more detailed conversation about funding, we are joined today by Abby and Tom from Unite Students. Unite Students has kindly sponsored today's event, and they're going to talk to us a little bit about some of the funding related matters, specifically around accommodation. So we're going to just kind of jump in with these. And Abby, I'm going to start with you. What are some of the different costs that students need to take into account when they're considering their accommodation options in the UK? Obviously, accommodation and where they're going to live is a huge chunk of the investment that they'll be making in studying abroad. But what are some of those costs that they should be planning for and thinking about?
Yeah, certainly. Hi, everyone. So glad to be here. So really that sort of will depend on the different types of accommodation that's available in the UK for students to look into. So we've got one option for you is what's called HMO, which essentially means, if you don't already know, house of multiple occupancy, or probably better known as essentially a shared house with a private landlord. Now, with an HMO, you are very likely to have to pay a deposit. So that's certainly a cost that you're going to need to factor in initially. And that is on top of your rent, okay? And some landlords may require your first month's rent in advance. You'll also need to check whether your energy bills, so gas, electric, water, for example, are included in that monthly rent, or if that's on top of that. Now, for us and most other sort of purpose-built student accommodation providers, all bills are included. And by bills, again, we're referring to the energy bills like your water, gas, and electric, but also things that you probably will have to pay extra for with an HMO, for example, such as Wi-Fi, insurance, gym membership. These are likely things that you're going to incur an additional cost with, but we actually include in our weekly rates. And so you don't need to worry about that. With Unite in particular, we also don't charge a deposit, but we do charge what's called an advance rent payment, which is part of your rent up front. So it's part of what is already owed, not on top of. Something else I would check is probably with regards to what type of guarantor is acceptable. Particularly with sort of private landlords or even some private student accommodation providers, as some of them only accept a UK guarantor. Now, international students do have the option to enlist the help of a third party who can act as a guarantor on your behalf, but naturally this comes as an additional cost. So although it's not the end of the world, it is a cost that you'll want to consider. And I would also say that another cost to factor in is the tenancy length you're paying for. So, for example, with Unite and other PBSAs or purpose-built student accommodation providers, we offer tenancies usually from sort of 40 weeks plus, whereas you'll find with your private landlords, they will likely expect you to stay for the full year. So that could mean having to factor in another 10 weeks of rent. Let's say. Now, Unite also do offer even shorter stays, so from as little as 3 weeks. So again, you don't necessarily have to commit to long stays depending upon your need and course requirements. So if you needed to arrive earlier than September for, let's say, a language course, then we could accommodate that for you as well. So they're the sort of key costs, I would say.
Excellent. Thanks, Abby. Tom, I want to turn to you now. I think for a lot of students, they're operating on a tight budget. They're pulling together funding from various sources, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in today's session. But specifically around accommodation, how can students finance their accommodation if they're on a tight budget, and are there resources available to help support them for this particular cost?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. So yeah, to answer that question, there's quite a few sources of finance that students can look into when they're applying for university. Probably the most well-known is the student loan, which students can apply for, and that's comprised of the loan for tuition fees, if applicable, for UK-based students. And there's also a maintenance aspect to that as well, which students can use to pay for rent or living costs and things. There's also bursaries, which are offered by universities, and they're quite open. So depending on your circumstances and depending on the university that you're applying to, you may be eligible for a bursary, which is effectively a grant. It's something that you don't have to pay back. And then there's also scholarships, and they're generally aimed at people or students, prospective students, who are either high achievers or who are studying qualification that's in demand. And again, that varies depending on the university, so it's worth contacting them, looking at the university websites to see what kind of financial help they offer. Speaking from an accommodation perspective, most student accommodation providers that are purpose-built, like United Students, offer some flexibility with payment plans. So speaking for us, we offer different kinds of payment schedules to suit how people are being funded. So it may be that you want to pay in one instalment and get everything out of the way. It might be that you want to break that down a bit more across the year, depending on how you're being funded, and that's absolutely fine. We offer that at the time of booking the room. But if your circumstances change, or if those schedules don't suit you, we're quite happy to have a look at how you're being funded and come up with something that's bespoke to you, because we just want to make things as easy as we possibly can for you. So if you were staying with us, you could speak to us, and we could have a look at what you're getting in and how we can work to make that work for you.
Excellent. So it sounds like there's a pretty good amount of flexibility in terms of supporting students and helping them find a way if the cost of accommodation is an obstacle for them. Obviously, accommodation is an important and a very large part of the annual budget for a student. What tips can you give to students who are looking for the best value for money accommodation based on their budget? Obviously, there's lots of options, but what would be your advice for students on that point?
Yeah, sure. So probably the first thing to look at is the city or cities that you're considering studying in, because certainly in the UK, there's quite a big variation between the average cost of living from one city to another. So speaking for Sheffield, where I live and where I'm based, the cost of living for students is actually really quite low. We've got some of the cheapest rents in the country for our accommodations. But if you were looking at a city that's maybe higher priced, like for example London, then you're probably going to have to think a bit more about maybe living outside of the city centre if possible. So for London, zones 3 or 4, and it's entirely possible to do that and still have good transport links to the universities. Obviously in London, you've got the tube, you've got buses, you've got overground taxis, etc. But all costs that you'd need to factor in. In terms of the actual accommodations themselves, I would say have a look at different accommodation types. So you might want to consider a flat share, or perhaps a room without an ensuite bathroom and sharing a bathroom. You might want to consider a room that doesn't have quite as many facilities as we would tend to call those a basic room, or maybe even a twin room where you share with another person. They tend to be cheaper, and it's a way of spreading the cost with others if you're open to that. The way that I always kind of tell people, or the way I get it across to people when I speak to them about it, is to make sure you know what you're willing to compromise on. So for me, you've got 3 things that you can have with a room or with an accommodation. You can have a good price, a good location, or good quality. and you can pick two of those things. So if you want a room in a really great location with amazing facilities, that's fine, but it is going to be more expensive. But a room that's cheaper but still in a really good location is probably going to be a little bit more basic. So as long as you understand what you're willing to compromise on, and are honest with yourself about that, then I'm sure you'll be able to find something within your budget. Speaking for ourselves, Unite offer a range of rooms across all of our cities to cater for students on almost all budgets, so we can generally find something that would suit you.
Excellent, thank you. Sorry, couldn't find that unmute button. And lastly, Abby, before we hand over to the rest of our conversation, I think it's obviously a big question for students around the pandemic and COVID, particularly international students who may or may not be able to make it to campus. I think just as it relates to funding and deposits and things like that, how have you been able to support students this past year in relation to the pandemic and travel restrictions and all of those things that are sort of out of everyone's control?
Yeah, sure. So this is naturally an extremely current topic, and one, you know, I appreciate you're going to want some reassurance on before you decide where you'd like to stay. So firstly, when COVID sort of initially impacted us back in, so over a year ago now, sort of February, March 2020, Unite were the first PBSA, private student accommodation provider, to completely release students from their contracts. So normally you are obviously tied into a tenancy length. However, in that instance, students who were staying with us at the time, obviously, who then completely understandably wanted to leave. So if they were already with us, wanted to leave us at that point and go back to stay with their families, we said, that's fine, no problem. Off you go. You will not be held liable for any of the remaining payments on your account. That was actually a pretty huge decision, pretty bold decision, and one that came at a huge cost to us as a business, but morally, of course, it was obviously the right thing to do, and in that sense was an easy decision. So since then, we've put in place other sort of more flexible options for our students. So for example, we allowed students who had booked a September 2020 start date with us to, in effect, delay their check-in if you couldn't physically get to us due to the travel restrictions in place. Obviously, those travel restrictions caused many issues for the majority of our international students. So we allowed you to delay the check-in. We did the same for those that had a January start date with us as well. And actually, in a normal, I use, that normal time, we would never have offered a January start date as an option, but I think that's a perfect example of where we sort of adapted to suit the needs of our students and their university courses. Most recently, we announced a rent discount. So for those students who again could not return to us after Christmas due to those travel restrictions, we gave a period where they would not be expected to pay their rent because they physically couldn't get back to us. And on top of that, we also offered the opportunity for them to extend over summer for free if that's something that they wanted to do. Not to mention, when we're looking sort of ahead, I suppose, at sort of 21-22 academic year, we have this year a very accommodating cancellation policy. So students actually have until the end of May to cancel their upcoming booking without any obligation at all. Normally we wouldn't, I'm being perfectly honest, we wouldn't normally offer that level of flexibility, but again, we're demonstrating just how much we're trying to support our students and then give them the time they need to make those decisions. Outside of those very COVID specific and reactive policies, if you will, we actually have our standard policies anyway. So we already offer what's called no place, no pay, or no visa, no pay. These are always available to our students. And essentially what they mean is, if you don't get into university for whatever reason, or you couldn't get a visa, study in the UK, then again, you're not held liable for that booking. You can cancel, that will be cancelled for you without any liability. Now you will find some other student accommodation providers offering very similar or alternative options as well. So obviously feel free to do your research, have a little look around those. What I would say is maybe err on the side of caution a little bit more and look a little bit more in depth at the private landlords. They don't tend to be quite as accommodating or flexible with those options, but again, do your research and have a look into that to make your informed decisions.
Thank you so much, Abby, and thank you, Tom. This information has been incredibly helpful in terms of thinking about accommodation, which is obviously a big portion of what students will be paying when they move abroad to study. And I think it's a really important topic to cover as we think about total cost of attendance and helping students really understand what that total investment will look like. So thank you so much to you both. For the second half of our conversation today, I am joined by student content editor Sita Bardwa here at Times Higher Education. And I'm really happy to have Sita here. We're going to just talk a little bit more about some of the critical questions around funding. I think there's a lot of questions that have come in from the audience, and I should caveat the conversation by saying that, you know, Sita and I unfortunately won't be able to answer questions that are specific or unique to your own circumstances. And unfortunately, a lot of funding eligibility and whether or not you will be eligible for certain scholarships or bursaries or things like that is really dependent on where you're coming from, where you're interested in studying, what you're interested in studying. So I think the best thing we can do today is just give you some really broad and general advice around where to look for sources of funding, how to understand what's out there and what's available. But I want to start by talking a little bit just about the value of studying abroad, because I think there's a lot of questions right now around, well, is this still worth it? Will I be able to get to campus? Won't I be able to get to campus? What will the student experience be like, especially because of COVID? And so I think it's really important that we sort of start by talking about what the value of this experience really is for students. And Sita, I wonder if you can start with that and just talk a little bit about why studying abroad is still such a valuable experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jamie. I think there are so many different reasons as to why studying abroad is still a really valuable experience. I think obviously the first thing is just the opportunity to study and explore and stay in a new country. You know, often when you go on holiday or if you just kind of go somewhere for a couple of weeks, you don't really get a feel for this new place. But whereas if you decide to go and stay and live somewhere for, you know, a year or 2 or 3, depending on how long you decide to study abroad for, you'll really get to immerse yourself in that culture. And the other thing is that obviously you also get the opportunity to travel from your base country too, which is a great way to kind of explore the world. Obviously, given the fact that there's lots of travel restrictions going on at the moment, that's not always an option right now, but certainly hopefully within the next year or so those things will open up. Additionally, there's just the chance to kind of meet people from all over the world and kind of learn about different points of view and different cultures. And this is also something that employers do really look favorably on as well, is if you have studied abroad, because it just shows so many different qualities that you have, such as, you know, the ability to go and stay somewhere else, which, you know, takes a lot of courage, it takes a lot of organization, it just takes so many different skills and qualities that employers will look at and think that, you know, will make you a really good fit for a job that they might potentially be hiring for. So yes, there are lots of really, really great reasons as to why students should consider studying abroad still, even now, when it's still perhaps not quite as the situation that they might be hoping that it would be.
Yeah, absolutely. I should say before we continue, it does appear that there are a few comments in the Q&A that there may be a few students who are having just technical troubles with the connection. And I just want to clarify for everyone that we will share the recording of this session. So if you're having trouble hearing us, or if you're unable to watch the entire session, we will share the recording. So you'll be able to watch it again. Sita, yes, I think you're absolutely right about the value of studying abroad and, you know, immersing yourself in a new culture and being surrounded by students who are from different places and different backgrounds, learning from faculty members who have all kinds of different backgrounds and experiences. It really is about, of course, the degree that you'll earn, but it's also about so much more than that. And it is definitely still a worthwhile investment for students. that said, it is a significant investment for students and their parents. And I think a lot of students feel perhaps initially just deterred by the whole idea because of the cost. We just did a session a few minutes ago about funding your degree in Australia. And I think the overwhelming message from that session was that there are a lot of options out there for international students. That's also the case here in the UK. I think one of the big sources for students is, of course, scholarships and awards that come directly from the universities that they're applying to. Wonder if you can just talk a little bit about what are some of the things that students should be researching and looking for, be it the subject area that they're planning to study, the home country that they're from, what are those different factors that maybe they should keep an eye out for that would make them eligible for particular scholarships, generally speaking?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you just said, there are so many different options and different opportunities for students looking for scholarships. And, again, as you said, the first place and the first port of call will probably be your university that you're applying to, and seeing what they have on offer. The other thing would also just to be consider, this probably will only affect a small number of students, but merit-based scholarships. So if you are a student that is, particularly high achieving or high performing in your subject area, then do look to see if there are particular scholarships available for those. There are also country-based scholarships. So depending on where you're coming from, there are lots of scholarships in the UK for example, students from Commonwealth countries or from different other particular countries around the world. So do check those out as well. And there are also, different organisations across the UK that do also have scholarships, in particular in certain subject areas. I think there might be more opportunity than perhaps other subject areas, but again, that's something to definitely consider. And the other thing to remember as well is that there are also the option of having part funded scholarships as well. So even if you aren't eligible for a full scholarship, there are certainly lots and lots of opportunities for scholarships that will perhaps help with a percentage of your tuition fees or a percentage of your study abroad time. So I would say one of the best ways to do it is to just have a research, have a look at your university website. Do ask your admissions officers too, if they know of any scholarships that you might be eligible for. Ask friends and family who have also studied abroad, and also just organisations within the country that your home country too. Banks and various different companies do also have scholarship opportunities as well. So there are lots of them. It's just a case of searching through them and finding the one that's right for you, really.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to remind students that researching, funding, and scholarships and funding that might come, as you said, from local organizations in your home country, that has to really be part of their research process from the earliest stage. When you start thinking about studying abroad, that's the right time to also start thinking about funding and how you're going to fund your degree and what scholarships you might be eligible for. Keep a list, keep organized, because there are so many opportunities out there. And I think it's a little bit of, short-term pain, long-term gain. It can be really difficult to find it all and to keep track of it all. But in the end, you can end up getting, significant support toward funding your education. We had Abby and Tom on at the start of this session to talk about accommodation, which, next to tuition is sort of the second largest piece of the puzzle in terms of funding your degree. And yesterday we did a short Instagram live with Save the Students, where we talked a little bit about some of the other costs associated with studying abroad. But I think it's helpful to just talk a little bit more about, you've got your tuition, and that's often very clear, black and white, what you'll be paying for your studies. Your accommodation, that will be part of the contract. You'll know exactly what those fees will be. But we talked about how experiencing the culture and student life and all of those things are so important. And those things can also cost money. So what are some of the other things that students should be budgeting for, whether it's travel, social life, those kinds of things that they need to just kind of have on their radar as they're thinking about cost of studying abroad?
Yeah, so on the studying side, there's obviously your course materials. So again, depending on what you're studying, you will probably have to buy or purchase textbooks or various different materials to kind of help with your studying. So, and students are often really surprised at just how much textbooks can cost, especially if you've got kind of quite a few. I mean, I studied English literature, so I obviously had to buy a lot of books for my course. And this is something that students just completely forget about, or just aren't aware of quite how expensive some of those books are. But a really good way to kind of get around that is to either find books that are being sold secondhand, or check whether your university library has multiple copies of your set text for books, or you can see whether your university has some kind of exchange group or book group. Lots of them do, so that's a really great way to kind of find books for a slightly lower cost. Other things, as you mentioned, Jamie, are kind of the social side of going to university. So your living costs, your kind of socializing costs, you know, going out and seeing your friends and doing things, traveling particularly. And again, something that's really great about the UK and also other countries as well, but the UK as well, is that there are student discount cards, and there are, you know, there's basically everywhere you go, see if you can ask for a student discount. So if you're going out to eat, even if you're getting your hair cut, anything, it's always worth asking, and lots of places will have discounts in place for students. So that's kind of one way to kind of ensure that you're keeping costs down, but still enjoying that social side of being at university.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to remind students that universities themselves do a lot to help students experience the local culture and experience the country even. They'll organize trips or social events and things like that often that are free to students. So, you know, take advantage of all of those things as well so that you're really getting the full experience. We are just about out of time, Sita, so thank you so much for joining me for the second half of our conversation today. I wonder if you want to just talk a little bit about some of the resources that are on timeshighereducation.com/student related to funding this week, as we're kind of really just highlighting the resources and the information that we have available to students during funding week.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have lots of articles on the THE student website around funding your degree, not just in the UK, but also in the US, Canada, Australia as well. But we've just recently put up an article that outlines all of the costs that you need to consider when you're studying abroad in the UK, which will be a really helpful one for any of you who've joined this session and are interested in knowing a bit more on that. We've also got some guides on scholarships and where you can find your scholarships to kind of get you started off on your search. Again, those are for the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. So do go check those out if you're interested in looking at scholarships. And then we've just also got some kind of slightly lighter articles around how to understand budgeting and how to kind of save some money while you're a student as well, and just how to manage your money when you're a student. So yeah, do go over to the Times Higher Education student website and have a look at those if you're interested in any of those things.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'll just add lastly that we've got a few more sessions this week. Tomorrow we're focusing on money saving tips from students in a session, a live webinar, and we're also doing a session about budgeting tools, how to create and stick to a budget. And then on Thursday, we'll tackle funding your degree in the US and in Canada in 2 separate sessions. So if you're interested in any of those, please make sure you are signed up to attend those events. Sita, massive thank you for joining me today. Really appreciate it. Thanks to our audience, and we'll see you next time at a THE student event. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.